In the scorching desert of ancient Mesopotamia, where the sun could kill a man in hours and water was more precious than gold, a single act of kindness would unleash forces beyond human understanding. This is not a tale of heroes or villains, but of a young girl whose compassionate heart would challenge the very balance that nature had spent millennia perfecting. Some say the desert remembers everything. Every footstep, every drop of spilled blood, every tear that falls upon its endless sands. But what happens when someone dares to change the order that has existed since time began? What happens when mercy collides with the ancient laws that govern life and death in the wasteland? The nomads of the great desert knew these laws well. They understood that survival demanded harsh choices, that the weak must perish so the strong could endure. They had learned, through countless generations, that nature's justice was swift, merciless, and absolute. But they had never encountered someone like Amira. This is her story, a story of how one girl's refusal to accept the brutal reality of desert life would set in motion events that would shake the very foundations of her world. A story of how nature itself would rise to restore the balance she had dared to disturb. Be warned, in the ancient world, kindness was not always rewarded, and the desert never forgot a debt. Amira had always been different from the other children of the Banu Hashim tribe. While her brothers and sisters played games that mimicked the harsh realities of desert survival, she spent her days watching the creatures that called the wasteland home. She noticed how the scorpions sought shelter under rocks during the burning noon hours, how the desert foxes emerged only when the moon painted the sand silver, and how even the most seemingly barren stretches of land harbored life that others couldn't see. The morning that would change everything began like countless others. The tribe was preparing to break camp and continue their seasonal migration toward the distant oasis of Kadesh. The camels were being loaded with precious water skins, dried dates, and the few possessions that meant the difference between life and death in the endless expanse of sand and stone. Amira's father, Khalil Ibn Rashid, was the tribe's most experienced guide. His eyes could read the desert like sacred text, finding water where others saw only death, navigating by stars that seemed identical to untrained observers. He had taught his daughter some of these skills, though he often worried about her tender heart. In the desert, compassion could be as deadly as a sandstorm. As the sun climbed higher, casting everything in harsh, unforgiving light, Amira noticed something that made her stomach clench with dread. One of their camels, an elderly female named Sapphira who had served the tribe faithfully for over 15 years, was limping badly. The animal's left rear leg appeared swollen, and she struggled to keep pace with the caravan. Amira watched with growing concern as Sapphira fell further and further behind. The other tribe members seemed not to notice, or perhaps they simply chose to ignore what they all knew was inevitable. In the harsh arithmetic of desert survival, a lame camel was a liability that could endanger the entire group. When the tribe stopped for their midday rest, Amira approached her father. The camp had been set up in the meager shade of some thorny acacia trees, and the adults were conserving their energy for the afternoon's journey. "Father," Amira said quietly, her voice barely audible over the whisper of wind through the branches, "Sapphira is hurt. Her leg is swollen, and she can barely walk." Khalil looked up from the map he had been studying, his weathered face creased with lines earned from decades of squinting into sandstorms and desert sun. He glanced toward where Sapphira stood apart from the other camels, her head hanging low with exhaustion and pain. "I know, my daughter," he said softly. "These things happen. The desert takes what it will. Amira felt her heart race. But we can't just leave her. She's been with us since I was born. She carried me when I was too small to walk through the deep sand. She's family. Her father's expression grew stern. This was a conversation he had hoped to avoid, but he knew it was inevitable. His daughter was nearly 15 now, old enough to understand the brutal realities that govern their existence. "Listen to me carefully, Amira," he said, his voice taking on the tone he used when teaching important lessons. "Sapphira has given us many good years. She has carried our children, our water, our very lives across thousands of miles of wasteland. But she is old now, and her time is ending. If we try to keep her with us, she will slow us down. The whole tribe could die waiting for one lame camel." Amira's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. Crying was a waste of precious water, a luxury they couldn't afford. "There must be something we can do, some way to heal her." "Even if there were," Khalil said gently, "we don't have the time or resources. We must reach Kadesh before the new moon, or we risk missing the caravan routes that will take us to the winter grazing grounds. You know this." But Amira couldn't accept it. That afternoon, as the tribe prepared to resume their journey, she lingered near Sapphira. The old camel's eyes held a depth of suffering that seemed almost human. Without thinking, Amira reached into her personal water pouch and poured some of the precious liquid in her cupped hands, offering it to the animal. Sapphira drank gratefully, and, for a moment, some life seemed to return to her eyes. Encouraged, Amira looked around until she found some tough desert grass growing near the base of one of the acacias. She pulled it up carefully and offered it to the camel, who nibbled at it eagerly. "What are you doing?" Amira spun around to find her younger brother Hakim watching her with wide eyes. At 12 years old, he was already showing signs of becoming a skilled desert hunter, and he understood the implications of what he was seeing. "She's hungry and thirsty," Amira said simply. "Father said we're leaving her behind," Hakim whispered, glancing around to make sure none of the adults could hear. "You're wasting water and food on an animal that's going to die anyway." Amira felt a flash of anger. "She's not going to die. I won't let her." Before Hakim could respond, the call went up from the front of the caravan. It was time to move. The tribe began filing out of the small oasis, their camels loaded and ready. Amira watched in growing desperation as the group started to pull away, leaving Sapphira standing alone in the shade of the acacias. Without hesitation, she grabbed the camel's lead rope and began trying to coax her forward. Sapphira took a few painful steps, but then stopped, unable to continue. The swelling in her leg had worsened, and she was clearly in agony. "Please," Amira whispered to the animal. "You have to try. I can't leave you here." But it was hopeless. Sapphira was simply too injured to travel. Amira could see her father approaching, his face set in grim determination. She knew what he was going to say, and she knew that this time there would be no arguing. "Amira," Khalil said quietly when he reached them, "it's time to let go." "No," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm staying with her." The declaration hung in the air between them like a thrown gauntlet. Around them, the sounds of the departing caravan grew fainter as the last of the tribe disappeared over a distant dune. Khalil's eyes widened with shock and fear. "You cannot be serious. You would risk your life for a dying animal." "She's not dying," Amira insisted, though even she could see how weak Sapphira had become. "And she's not just an animal. She's been part of our family longer than I've been alive." For a long moment, father and daughter stared at each other. In the distance, they could hear Amira's mother calling her name, the sound growing fainter with each passing second. "If you stay here," Khalil said slowly. You will both die. The nearest water is 2 days away on foot, and that's if you know exactly where you're going. You have perhaps half a day's worth of water in your pouch, and no food except what you can forage. This is madness. Amira's resolve wavered for a moment. She thought of her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair in the mornings, of her baby sister Layla's infectious laugh, of the safety and warmth of the tribe's evening fires. But then she looked at Sapphira's trusting eyes and knew she couldn't abandon her. Then, teach me, she said firmly. Tell me which direction to go to find water. Tell me what plants I can eat and which ones will kill me. Give me a chance to save her. Khalil was quiet for so long that Amira began to think he would simply drag her away by force. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with sorrow and resignation. There is a small spring about 15 miles to the northwest. It's hidden in a canyon between two red rock formations that look like sleeping giants. If you travel only at night and rest during the day, you might reach it before your water runs out. But Amira, even if you make it there, Sapphira may not survive the journey. Amira nodded solemnly. I understand. Her father reached into his robes and pulled out a small leather pouch. These are medicinal herbs. Mix them with water and make a poultice for her leg. It may help with the swelling. He hesitated, then added, There's enough here for 3 days. If she's not better by then. He didn't finish the sentence, but Amira understood. If the camel wasn't better in 3 days, she would have to make the heartbreaking choice to continue alone or die alongside her four-legged friend. Khalil embraced his daughter fiercely, as if trying to memorize the feeling of her in his arms. The stars will guide you, he whispered. Follow the constellation of the hunter toward the northwest. And remember, my brave daughter, sometimes the greatest courage is knowing when to let go. With that, he mounted his own camel and rode hard to catch up with the tribe, leaving Amira alone in the vast desert with only an injured camel and her own determination for company. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Amira made her first camp. She had never been alone in the desert before, and every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. The howling of distant jackals made her skin crawl, and the scurrying of unseen creatures in the darkness kept her constantly on edge. She mixed her father's herbs with a small amount of precious water and gently applied the poultice to Sapphira's swollen leg. The camel endured the treatment patiently, seeming to understand that Amira was trying to help. We're going to make it, Amira whispered to her companion as she settled down beside the resting animal. I promise you, we're going to make it. But as the desert night deepened around them, filled with sounds and shadows that spoke of danger and death, Amira began to wonder if her compassion had led them both into a trap from which there could be no escape. The ancient laws of the desert were not easily defied, and she was about to learn just how jealously nature guarded its harsh but necessary balance. The first night passed in fits and starts of restless sleep. Every sound made Amira's heart race with fear that predators had caught their scent. She had heard stories of desert wolves that could track wounded animals for days, waiting for them to become too weak to defend themselves. The thought of Sapphira's injury broadcasting their vulnerability to every carnivore within miles made her stomach clench with anxiety. When the pale light of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, Amira was both relieved and dismayed. They had survived the night, but Sapphira's condition seemed unchanged. The old camel struggled to rise, favoring her injured leg heavily. However, she did manage to stand, which Amira took as an encouraging sign. Following her father's advice, Amira had planned to travel only during the cooler hours of night and early morning. The desert sun could be merciless, and walking during the hottest part of the day would be suicide for both of them. She carefully rationed out a small amount of water for herself, and Sapphira then began the slow process of getting them both moving toward the hidden spring. The landscape around them was a study in desolation. Rolling dunes stretched endlessly in every direction, broken occasionally by rocky outcroppings and thorny shrubs that somehow managed to survive in the hostile environment. The sand beneath their feet was already growing warm, promising the scorching heat that would come with the rising sun. Amira tried to remember everything her father had taught her about desert navigation. The constellation of the Hunter, which the tribe called Sef Aljabar, had pointed her in the right direction during the night. Now, as the stars faded into the brightening sky, she would need to rely on other landmarks. She looked for the two red rock formations her father had described, scanning the horizon until she spotted what might be the sleeping giants in the distance. They were much farther away than she had hoped, appearing as little more than reddish smudges against the pale morning sky. "Come on, old friend," she whispered to Sapphira, gently tugging on the lead rope. "We have a long way to go." Their progress was painfully slow. Sapphira could only manage a few hundred yards at a time before needing to rest. Each step seemed to cause her significant pain, and Amira found herself torn between pushing forward and allowing the camel the recovery time she obviously needed. By mid-morning, the sun had become a merciless enemy. Even with her head covered by her traditional hijab and her body protected by loose-fitting robes, Amira could feel the heat beginning to sap her strength. She found a large boulder that cast a decent shadow and guided Sapphira into the meager shade. The temperature continued to climb throughout the day. Amira dozed fitfully, always keeping one eye on their surroundings. She had brought some dried dates and a small portion of flatbread, but the heat had stolen her appetite. Instead, she focused on conserving what little water remained in her pouch. During the long, burning hours of afternoon, something unexpected happened. Sapphira began to show signs of improvement. The poultice that Amira had applied to her leg seemed to be working. The swelling had gone down noticeably, and the camel appeared to be in less pain. Encouraged by this development, Amira decided to risk traveling a bit during the late afternoon, when the sun was lower, but before full darkness fell. They managed to cover nearly 2 miles before the heat became unbearable again. That evening, as they made their second camp, Amira allowed herself to feel cautiously optimistic. They had covered perhaps a third of the distance to the spring, and Sapphira seemed to be recovering. Maybe her father's herbs were more powerful than she had dared to hope. She applied a fresh poultice to the camel's leg and shared a precious portion of water with her companion. As the stars emerged overhead, she found the constellation of the Hunter and confirmed that they were still heading in the right direction. The second night of travel went much better than the first. Sapphira was able to maintain a steady, if slow, pace for several hours. They stopped frequently to rest, but each rest period was shorter than the one before. Amira began to believe that they might actually reach the hidden spring in time. It was during their third day that things began to go wrong in ways that Amira couldn't have anticipated. She awoke from an uneasy sleep to find that the wind had shifted during the morning hours. Instead of the usual dry heat that characterized the desert, the air felt different somehow. There was a tension in the atmosphere that made her skin crawl with unease. Looking up at the sky, Amira saw clouds beginning to gather on the eastern horizon. At first, she felt a surge of hope. Clouds meant the possibility of rain, and rain would solve their water problems. But as the day progressed, the clouds grew darker and more ominous. Her father had taught her to read the signs of desert weather, and what she saw developing overhead filled her with dread. These weren't the high, wispy clouds that sometimes brought gentle rain. These were the massive, churning formations that preceded the violent storms that could reshape the desert landscape in a matter of hours. By early afternoon, the wind had intensified dramatically. Sand began whipping through the air with stinging force, and the temperature dropped suddenly as the approaching storm blocked out the sun. Amira knew they needed shelter, and they needed it fast. She looked around desperately for anything that could protect them from what was coming. The landscape here was even more barren than before, offering nothing but open sand and scattered rocks. The red rock formations that marked their destination were still miles away, too far to reach before the storm hit. "We have to find cover," she told Sapphira urgently. But the camels seemed to sense the approaching danger and had become increasingly agitated. Her eyes rolled with fear, and she kept trying to turn back the way they had come. The first lightning strike lit up the darkening sky like a giant's torch. The thunder that followed was so loud that Amira felt it in her bones. She had never been caught in the open during a desert storm, but she had heard the stories. Flash floods could appear from nowhere, turning dry riverbeds into raging torrents in minutes. Lightning strikes could kill instantly, and the wind could be strong enough to sandblast the skin from a person's body. Amira spotted a small depression in the landscape, perhaps formed by ancient water erosion. It wasn't much, but it might offer some protection from the worst of the wind. She managed to coax Sapphira down into the shallow bowl, just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. What started as scattered drops quickly became a deluge. Rain hammered down with a fury that seemed almost supernatural. Within minutes, Amira and Sapphira were soaked through, huddling together in their inadequate shelter as water began pooling around them. At first, Amira was grateful for the water, even opening her mouth to catch some of the precious liquid. But as the rain continued to pour down with increasing intensity, she realized they were in mortal danger. The depression that had seemed like salvation was rapidly filling with runoff from the surrounding higher ground. Lightning cracked across the sky with terrifying frequency, each bolt followed by thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very earth. The wind howled like a living thing, driving sand and water horizontal across the landscape with brutal force. Sapphira was terrified, pressing close against Amira for comfort. The young girl wrapped her arms around the camel's neck, trying to provide what little reassurance she could while fighting her own rising panic. The water in their shelter was now ankle-deep and rising fast. As if the storm itself wasn't enough, Amira began to notice other disturbing signs. Small creatures were emerging from the desert around them, driven from their underground burrows by the flooding. Scorpions scuttled past their hiding spot, their stingers raised defensively. Snakes writhed through the muddy water, seeking higher ground. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that seemed to come from the storm itself. Above the howling wind and crashing thunder, Amira could swear she heard something that sounded almost like voices. Not human voices, but something older and more primal, as if the desert itself was speaking. The voices seemed to be saying something in a language she couldn't understand, but their tone was unmistakably angry. It was as if nature itself was furious about something, and that fury was being directed at them specifically. Hours passed in this nightmare of wind, water, and fear. Amira's water pouch, which had been nearly empty, was now full of fresh rainwater, but she was too terrified to appreciate the irony. The depression they sheltered in had become a small lake, forcing them to stand in water up to their knees. Just when Amira thought they might actually drown in what should have been their salvation, the storm began to abate. The rain lessened from a torrential downpour to a steady shower, then to scattered drops. The wind died down, and the lightning moved off toward the western horizon. As the clouds began to break apart, revealing patches of star-studded sky, Amira assessed their situation. They were both exhausted, soaked, and shivering in the sudden cold that followed desert storms. But they were alive, and they now had more water than they could carry. However, something fundamental had changed during the storm. The landscape around them looked completely different. Familiar landmarks had been obscured by new sand dunes, and the tracks they had been following were completely gone. Worst of all, when Amira looked toward where the red rock formation should have been, she saw nothing but darkness. The storm had not only soaked them and terrified them, it had left them completely lost in the vast expanse of the desert. And as Amira looked up at the stars, trying to find the constellation of the hunter to reorient herself, she realized with growing horror that even the familiar patterns in the sky seemed different somehow, as if the storm had rearranged the very heavens themselves. Sapphira sensed her distress and nuzzled against her shoulder, offering what comfort she could. The camel's leg was much better after the enforced rest during the storm, but now they faced an even greater challenge. They had water, but they were lost in an alien landscape with no idea which direction would lead them to safety. As the desert night settled around them, cold and filled with the sound of dripping water, Amira began to understand that their ordeal was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. The morning that followed the storm revealed a landscape so dramatically altered that Amira could barely believe her eyes. Where once there had been familiar dunes and rocky outcroppings, now there were entirely new formations. Sand had been moved by the wind and water into patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if some invisible artist had reshaped the desert according to a design known only to the forces of nature. Even more disturbing were the plants and animals that had appeared seemingly overnight. Desert flowers that should not have bloomed for months had burst from the sand in brilliant displays of color. Strange cacti with unusual formations had emerged from what had been barren ground just the day before. And everywhere there were creatures that Amira had never seen in all her years of desert life. Sapphira seemed as unsettled as her human companion by these changes. The camel's leg had healed remarkably during the storm, but now she appeared nervous and skittish, constantly looking around as if expecting threats from every direction. Her nostrils flared continuously, testing the air for scents that seemed to disturb her. Amira tried to use the sun to determine their direction, but even that basic navigation aid seemed unreliable. The light had a different quality to it, more intense somehow, and it cast shadows at angles that didn't match her expectations. When she attempted to locate the red rock formations that marked their destination, she found nothing but unfamiliar terrain stretching to every horizon. As they began walking, Amira noticed that their progress was being monitored. Small lizards with unusual coloring perched on rocks and watched their every move. Birds she had never seen before circled overhead, their calls sounding more like warnings than simple animal communication. Even the insects seemed different, moving in organized patterns that suggested intelligence beyond what she would have expected from such simple creatures. The most unsettling discovery came when they stopped for their first rest. As Amira knelt beside a small pool of water that had collected in a natural rock basin, she saw her own reflection and gasped in shock. Her face looked older somehow, as if the storm had aged her by several years. Her eyes held a depth that hadn't been there before, and her skin had taken on a weathered appearance that spoke of hardships beyond her actual experience. When she looked at Sapphira, she saw similar changes. The camel's coat had a lustrous sheen that seemed almost supernatural, and her eyes gleamed with an intelligence that was definitely not normal for her species. It was as if the storm had not only changed the landscape around them, but had altered them as well in some fundamental way. They spent the day traveling through this strange new world, following what Amira hoped was still a northwesterly direction. The sun's path across the sky was their only reliable guide, but even that seemed slightly off from what she remembered. The heat was more intense than usual, and the light had an almost hypnotic quality that made it difficult to think clearly. During their midday rest, Amira encountered her first direct sign that something truly supernatural was happening. While searching for edible plants among the rocks, she discovered a small spring that definitely hadn't been there before the storm. The water was crystal clear and refreshingly cool, but when she knelt to drink, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Voices were coming from the water itself. At first, she thought it might be an echo of some distant sound, but as she listened more carefully, she realized the voices were speaking directly to her. They were using her language, but the accent was unlike anything she had ever heard, as if the speakers were trying to form words with mouths that weren't designed for human speech. "Why do you persist in this defiance?" the voices asked, their tone carrying a weight of ancient authority. "Why do you struggle against the natural order that has governed this land since time began?" Amira's first instinct was to run, but curiosity and a strange compulsion kept her kneeling by the spring. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle bubbling of the water. "We are the guardians of balance," came the reply. "We are the ones who ensure that the strong survive and the weak perish, as it must be for life to continue in this harsh realm. You have upset that balance with your misplaced compassion." The accusation hit Amira like a physical blow. "I saved her life," she said, glancing back toward Sapphira, who was resting in the shade of a newly formed rock spire. "There's nothing wrong with showing mercy." "Mercy?" The voices seemed to find this concept amusing. "You call it mercy to prolong suffering? You call it mercy to risk your own life and the stability of the natural world for one dying animal? Child, you understand nothing of the forces you have awakened." Images began forming in the clear water of the spring. Amira saw her tribe struggling through the desert, moving slowly because they were searching for her. She saw her father's face, etched with worry and grief. She saw her mother weeping as she looked back along their trail, hoping for some sign that her daughter might still be alive. "Your family suffers because of your choice," the voices continued mercilessly. "Your father blamed himself for allowing your foolishness. Your mother grows weak with sorrow. Even now, they risk the safety of the entire tribe by delaying their journey to search for you. Is this the mercy you speak of?" Amira felt tears beginning to fall, but she refused to give in to despair. "I couldn't let her die alone in the desert. She served our family faithfully for years. She deserved better." Deserved? The voices rose with what sounded like anger. The desert does not deal in human concepts of deserving. The desert deals only in the reality of survival. The strong live, the weak die, and the balance is maintained. You have disrupted that balance, and now nature itself must take action to restore it. The images in the water changed, showing scenes that made Amira's heart race with terror. She saw storms raging across the desert with unprecedented fury. She saw oases drying up, leaving entire tribes stranded without water. She saw animals fleeing their traditional territories, disrupting migration patterns that had existed for millennia. All of this is happening because you chose to save one dying camel, she asked, unable to believe what she was seeing. All of this is happening because you chose to place your human emotions above the natural laws that govern existence, the voices replied. The desert is a living system, child. Every creature, every plant, every grain of sand has its place in a balance that has been perfected over countless ages. When one element is removed from its proper role or kept alive past its natural time, the entire system becomes unstable. Amira stared at the terrible images in the water, seeing consequences she had never imagined stretching out like ripples from a stone thrown into a still pond. But even faced with this evidence of the chaos she had allegedly unleashed, she couldn't bring herself to regret her decision. If the system is so perfect, she said quietly, then why does it need you to protect it? Why can't it handle one act of kindness without falling apart? The water in the spring suddenly began to bubble and churn as if her question had struck a nerve. You dare to question the wisdom of ages? You dare to suggest that your limited human understanding supersedes the knowledge of the eternal forces that shaped this world. I dare to suggest that maybe the system isn't as perfect as you think, Amira said, surprising herself with her boldness. Maybe it needs to change. Maybe it needs to make room for mercy and compassion, even if that makes it less efficient. The response was immediate and terrifying. The water in the spring turned dark and began to emit a sulfurous smell. The voices rose to a shriek that seemed to come from every direction at once. You will learn the price of your arrogance, child. You will discover what happens when humans try to improve upon the perfection of nature. The desert itself will be your teacher, and the lessons will be written in suffering that will echo through generations. With that pronouncement, the spring went silent. The water cleared and returned to its natural appearance, but Amira noticed that it no longer looked inviting. Something in its depths seemed to watch her with malevolent intelligence. She backed away from the spring slowly, then hurried to where Sapphira was waiting. The camel seemed agitated, as if she too had sensed the supernatural confrontation that had just taken place. "Come on," Amira whispered urgently. "We need to keep moving." As they resumed their journey through the transformed landscape, Amira couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by countless unseen eyes. The very air around them seemed charged with hostility, and every shadow appeared to hide potential threats. The afternoon brought new challenges that seemed designed to test her resolve. The temperature rose to levels that should have been impossible, forcing them to seek shelter every few hundred yards. The terrain became increasingly difficult to navigate, with sudden drop-offs and treacherous loose sand that threatened to swallow them with each step. Most disturbing of all were the mirages that began appearing with increasing frequency. But these weren't ordinary heat mirages. These showed scenes from Amira's memories, twisted into accusations and regrets. She saw her tribe's departure, but now her family's faces were filled with disgust and disappointment rather than sorrow. She saw Sapphira as she had been before the injury, healthy and strong, but now the camel's eyes held recrimination, as if blaming Amira for the suffering that had followed. By evening, when they finally found a sheltered spot to make camp, Amira was emotionally drained and physically exhausted. But as she looked at Sapphira, she noticed something that gave her hope. Despite all the supernatural pressure they had endured, the camel's injury had continued to heal. She was walking normally now, showing no sign of the lameness that had condemned her to abandonment. "They're wrong," Amira whispered to her companion as the strange stars emerged overhead in patterns she didn't recognize. "Whatever the cost, saving your life was the right thing to do. I won't let their threats make me regret showing mercy." But even as she spoke these brave words, Amira couldn't ignore the growing dread in her heart. The supernatural forces aligned against them were clearly just beginning their campaign of retribution. Tomorrow would bring new trials, and she was beginning to understand that their journey had become about much more than simply finding water and returning to safety. They were now at the center of a cosmic struggle between the ancient laws of survival and the human capacity for compassion. And the outcome would determine not just their own fate, but the future balance between mercy and merciless natural law in the eternal desert. The fourth day brought horrors that challenged everything Amira thought she knew about the natural world. She awoke to find that their camp had been surrounded during the night by creatures that should not have existed. Scorpions the size of small dogs prowled the perimeter, their stingers glowing with an eerie phosphorescent light. Snakes with patterns on their scales that seemed to shift and move on their own coiled around nearby rocks, watching her with intelligence that was far too human for comfort. But most terrifying of all was the silence. In all her years in the desert, Amira had never experienced such complete, unnatural quiet. No wind stirred the sand. No insects buzzed or chirped. Even the sound of her own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself was absorbing all noise. Sapphira was trembling with fear, but the camel had positioned herself between Amira and the circle of supernatural creatures, as if trying to protect her young rescuer. The gesture was both touching and heartbreaking, reminding Amira of why she had risked everything to save this loyal animal in the first place. As the sun rose, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward them with grasping fingers, the creatures began to retreat. But they didn't disappear entirely. Instead, they maintained a constant presence just beyond clear sight, moving through the landscape like a living escort of menace. Amira forced herself to pack their few belongings and continue the journey, but every step felt like a descent into deeper danger. The landscape continued to change around them, becoming more alien and threatening with each passing hour. Rock formations twisted themselves into shapes that hurt to look at directly. Plants grew in patterns that seemed to form symbols or letters in languages that predated human civilization. The heat intensified beyond anything Amira had ever experienced. Despite having plenty of water from the storm, both she and Sapphira were constantly on the verge of heat exhaustion. The sun seemed to follow them specifically, maintaining its position directly overhead regardless of the actual time of day. During what should have been the cooler morning hours, they encountered their first major obstacle. A massive chasm had opened in the desert floor, stretching as far as they could see in both directions. The gap was at least 50 feet wide and appeared to descend in a bottomless darkness. There was no way around it, and certainly no way across. Amira stared at the impossible barrier in despair. They had come so far, endured so much, and now they were stopped by what seemed to be a deliberate act of supernatural intervention. "This is your last warning, child." The voice came from the depths of the chasm, echoing up from the darkness with a resonance that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. It was the same voice that had spoken to her from a spring, but now it carried the full weight of cosmic authority. "Turn back now," the voice continued. "Accept that your actions have consequences beyond your understanding. Leave the camel here, where nature intended her to die, and perhaps you will be allowed to find your way back to your people. Amira looked down at Sapphira, whose eyes held perfect trust despite all the terror they had endured together. The camel was healthy now, completely recovered from her injury. She could easily survive on her own in the desert, finding food and water with the skills that had kept her species alive for thousands of years. For a moment, Amira seriously considered the offer. She was tired of running, tired of being afraid, tired of being responsible for cosmic disasters that she couldn't understand. It would be so easy to simply walk away and let the natural order restore itself. But then she remembered something her father had taught her years ago. He had been explaining why their tribe helped travelers they encountered in the desert, even when those travelers had nothing to offer in return. The desert teaches us that survival requires both strength and compassion, he had said. The strong survive, yes, but the truly strong are those who use their strength to protect the weak. A tribe that abandons its principles in the face of hardship is no better than a pack of scavenging dogs. I won't abandon her, Amira called down into the chasm, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even herself. Not for you, not for cosmic balance, not for anything. If saving one life destroys your perfect system, then maybe the system needs to be destroyed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The ground beneath their feet began to shake violently, and the sound that rose from the chasm was like the roar of 1,000 storms. Cracks appeared in the desert floor, racing outward from the massive gap like a spider web of destruction. So be it, the voice thundered. You have chosen your path, and now you will walk it to its bitter end. But know this, daughter of defiance. Your compassion will be the death of everything you hold dear. The chasm suddenly began to close, the massive walls of stone sliding together with grinding violence. For a terrifying moment, Amira thought they would be crushed, but instead, a narrow bridge of rock formed across the gap, just wide enough for them to cross single file. The bridge was clearly a trap, but there was no alternative. Amira led Sapphira out onto the precarious span, trying not to look down into the darkness that still yawned beneath them. The stone felt unstable under their feet, cracking and shifting with each step. Halfway across, the bridge began to crumble. Chunks of rock broke away and tumbled into the abyss below, and the entire structure swayed dangerously. Amira urged Sapphira to move faster, but the frightened camel was having trouble maintaining her footing on the deteriorating surface. Just as it seemed they would plunge to their deaths, Sapphira did something that defied all logic. The camel suddenly leaped forward with impossible grace, clearing the remaining distance to solid ground in a single bound and carrying Amira with her. They landed hard but safely on the far side of the chasm, just as the bridge collapsed completely behind them. Amira stared back at the now unbridgeable gap in amazement. There was no way Sapphira should have been able to make that jump. Camels weren't built for such athletic feats, and the distance had been far greater than any normal animal could cover. Looking at her companion with new eyes, Amira began to suspect that the supernatural forces affecting the desert had touched Sapphira as well. The camel's recovery from her injury had been remarkably fast, and now she had displayed abilities that bordered on the magical. As they continued their journey away from the chasm, strange phenomena began manifesting around them with increasing frequency. The sand beneath their feet occasionally turned to water, forcing them to leap quickly to more solid ground. Trees appeared and disappeared like mirages, sometimes offering shade that turned out to be illusory. The very air shimmered with heat waves that formed shapes and patterns, creating a constantly shifting environment that was as beautiful as it was terrifying. By midday, The persecution had become more personal and direct. Voices called to Amira from every direction, using the voices of her family members to try to convince her to give up her quest. She heard her father pleading with her to be reasonable, her mother crying for her to come home, her siblings begging her not to sacrifice herself for an animal. The voices were perfect imitations, capturing every nuance of speech and emotion that she remembered from her loved ones. But Amira had learned to recognize the underlying malevolence that tainted these supernatural communications. No matter how perfectly they mimicked her family's voices, they couldn't hide their essential alienness. The worst trial came in the late afternoon, when they crested a small hill and found themselves looking down at a perfect recreation of their tribe's camp. Every detail was exactly as Amira remembered it. The patterns of the tents, the positions of the animals, even the smell of cooking fires, and the sound of children playing. Her family was there, looking exactly as they had when she last saw them, but their faces were filled with joy and relief at her return. Her father rushed toward her with open arms, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "My daughter," he cried, "you've come back to us. We thought we had lost you forever." For a moment, Amira's resolve wavered. The temptation to run down the hill and throw herself into her father's embrace was almost overwhelming. After days of fear and supernatural persecution, the promise of safety and love seemed worth any price. But Sapphira sensed the deception and refused to move toward the camp. The camel planted her feet firmly and looked at Amira with eyes that seemed to say, "This is not real. Don't be fooled." Looking more carefully at the scene below, Amira began to notice subtle wrongness in the details. Her father's tears fell upward instead of down. Her mother's smile was too wide, stretching beyond what human facial muscles could achieve. The children's laughter had an echo that suggested vast, empty spaces rather than the close confines of the camp. "You're not real," she called down to the figures below. "You're just another test, another attempt to make me abandon her." The response was immediate and horrifying. The false family members began to melt and distort, their features flowing like wax in extreme heat. Their voices rose in a cacophony of anguish and accusation, blaming Amira for their dissolution and promising terrible vengeance for her continued defiance. The illusion collapsed completely, leaving nothing but barren desert where the camp had appeared to be. But the voices continued to echo across the landscape, promising that this was only the beginning of the torments that awaited her. As evening approached, Amira and Sapphira found themselves in a landscape that had become completely alien. The very physics of the world seemed unreliable here. Water flowed uphill, shadows fell in directions that had no relationship to the sun's position, and the ground sometimes rippled like liquid despite appearing solid. They made camp in the shelter of some rocks that looked more stable than the surrounding environment, but Amira doubted they would get much rest. The supernatural forces arrayed against them were clearly escalating their campaign of harassment, and she had the distinct feeling that tomorrow would bring challenges that made today's trials seem mild by comparison. As she settled down beside Sapphira for what might be their last night together, Amira reflected on how far they had come from the simple act of compassion that had started this nightmare. She had saved a dying camel, and, in response, the very forces of nature had declared war on her. But, looking at Sapphira's peaceful expression as the camel rested beside her, Amira knew she would make the same choice again without hesitation. Whatever cosmic laws she had violated, whatever balance she had disrupted, the trust and loyalty in her companion's eyes made it all worthwhile. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation with the powers that govern the desert. Tomorrow, they would either find their way to safety or perish together in the attempt. But tonight, they were still alive, still together, and still defying the ancient order that demanded the sacrifice of the weak for the survival of the strong. The fifth day dawned with an ominous crimson sky that stretched from horizon to horizon, as if the very heavens were bleeding. The air itself felt thick and oppressive, making each breath a conscious effort. Amira knew without being told that this would be the day of final reckoning, when the supernatural forces she had defied would make their ultimate attempt to restore the balance she had disrupted. Sapphira was restless, pacing in small circles and constantly looking toward the north with an urgency that suggested she sensed something beyond human perception. Following the camel's gaze, Amira could just make out what appeared to be structures in the distance, shimmering like mirages, but maintaining their shape too consistently to be mere heat distortions. As they began walking toward these mysterious formations, the persecution that had plagued them for days intensified to levels that bordered on the unbearable. The ground beneath their feet alternated between burning sand that scorched through the soles of their sandals and patches of ice that appeared without warning, threatening to send them tumbling with each step. The air filled with voices speaking in countless languages, some human and others that seemed to come from throats never meant for speech. They all carried the same message, delivered with increasing desperation and fury. Turn back, abandon the camel, restore the natural order before it was too late. But, mixed with these hostile voices, Amira began to hear something else. Faint and distant, but growing stronger with each mile they covered, came the sound of human voices calling her name. Not the supernatural imitations that had tormented her before, but the genuine calls of her own people. "They're here," she whispered to Sapphira, hardly daring to believe it. "My family is here. They found us." The realization filled her with a mixture of joy and dread. Joy because it meant they were no longer alone in this nightmare landscape. Dread because it meant her loved ones had entered the zone of supernatural conflict and were now at risk of becoming caught up in the cosmic forces she had unleashed. As they crested the next dune, the scene that greeted them was both wonderful and terrible. Below them, stretched across a small oasis that definitely hadn't existed in this location before, was her entire tribe. But they weren't alone. Surrounding the oasis was an army of creatures that defied description. Some were animals that had been twisted into impossible forms, with too many legs or heads that faced in multiple directions. Others were humanoid figures that seemed to be made from living sand or stone, moving with jerky, unnatural motions. And above them all, the sky itself seemed alive, swirling with patterns that hurt to look at directly. The two forces faced each other in a tense standoff. The tribe had formed a defensive circle around the oasis, their camels and horses nervous but holding their ground. The supernatural army maintained its distance but radiated menace that was almost tangible. At the center of it all stood Amira's father, Khalil, his weathered hands gripping a staff that glowed with soft blue light. She had never seen the staff before, but somehow she knew it was an ancient artifact passed down through generations of desert guides who had learned to deal with the supernatural forces that occasionally stirred in the deepest parts of the wasteland. "Daughter," Khalil called across the distance, his voice carrying clearly despite the supernatural tumult around them. "You have walked a hard path, but it is time to choose. Will you stand with the ancient ways, or will you continue to defy the balance that has kept our people alive for countless generations?" Before Amira could respond, The voice of the supernatural forces rose from all around them, speaking through the mouths of the twisted creatures and echoing from the living sky itself. She has gone too far to turn back now, mortal. She has disrupted the fundamental laws that govern existence in this realm. The price must be paid, and payment will be taken from her people if she continues to refuse her responsibility. To demonstrate their power, the supernatural army began to advance. The very ground shook under their approach, and the air filled with a sound like the universe itself screaming. Several of the tribe's animals panicked and tried to flee, only to find themselves trapped by invisible barriers that had formed around the oasis. But Sapphira did something that changed everything. The camel stepped forward, placing herself between the advancing supernatural army and the terrified humans. As she did so, her form began to change. The camel's ordinary brown coat suddenly shimmered and transformed into a lustrous silver that reflected light in patterns too complex for normal eyes to follow. Her size increased dramatically until she towered over the assembled humans like a creature from legend. Most dramatically of all, her eyes began to glow with the same soft, blue light that emanated from Khalil's staff. When Sapphira spoke, her voice was no longer that of an animal, but of something far older and wiser than any creature that had ever walked the earth. "Enough," she said, and the single word carried the weight of absolute authority. For too long, the balance has been maintained through cruelty disguised as necessity. For too long, compassion has been labeled as weakness and mercy dismissed as foolishness. This child has shown us a better way. The supernatural army stopped their advance, clearly stunned by this development. The voices that had been tormenting Amira fell silent, and even the living sky seemed to pause in its chaotic swirling. "You are not what you appear to be," the guardians of the old balance said, their collective voice now tinged with uncertainty. "What are you, creature? What right do you have to interfere in matters beyond mortal understanding?" Sapphira's transformed features showed something that might have been amusement. "I am what this desert could become if it learned to temper its harshness with kindness. I am the future that awaits when strength is used to protect rather than to dominate. And I have every right to speak, for I am what you fear most. Proof that the old ways can change without destroying everything you seek to preserve." The revelation hit Amira like a physical blow. Sapphira hadn't been just an ordinary camel whose life she had saved. She had been something far more significant, a test, perhaps, or maybe an agent of change that had been waiting for someone with enough courage to choose compassion over convenience. The natural order exists for good reason. The supernatural forces protested, but their voices lacked their earlier conviction. Without it, the strong will be dragged down by the weak, and all will perish together in the desert's embrace. "The natural order, as you have enforced it," Sapphira replied calmly, "has created a world where mercy is punished, and kindness is seen as a luxury that none can afford. But this child has shown that there is another way. She risked everything to save a life that others had written off as worthless. In doing so, she proved that true strength lies not in the ability to abandon the weak, but in the willingness to sacrifice for them." Around the oasis, Amira could see her people beginning to understand what was happening. Her father lowered his glowing staff, and her mother stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. Even the children stopped their crying and watched in wonder as ancient forces debated the future of their world. "If we accept this change," the supernatural guardians asked slowly, "what guarantee do we have that the balance will be maintained?" What assurance can you give that compassion will not lead to the destruction of all life in this harsh realm? Sapphira's response was to gesture toward Amira and her family. Look at them, she said. See how they have thrived, not despite their compassion, but because of it. They help strangers they meet in the desert, not because they expect reward, but because it is the right thing to do. They share their water and food with those in need, even when they have little to spare. And yet they survive year after year because their kindness creates bonds that sustain them when individual strength would fail. The debate continued for hours as the sun moved across the strange, crimson sky. Ancient laws were examined and challenged, traditional assumptions questioned and tested. Through it all, Amira found herself at the center of a cosmic struggle that would determine not just her own fate, but the future character of the desert itself. Finally, as the day began to fade toward evening, a decision was reached. The supernatural army began to withdraw, their twisted forms dissolving back into the sand and stone from which they had emerged. The living sky gradually returned to its normal blue, and the oppressive atmosphere that had weighed on them all began to lift. The balance will be maintained, the fading voices of the guardians declared, but it will be a new balance, one that includes mercy as well as hardship, compassion as well as strength. Let this be the beginning of a kinder age, though we warn that kindness without wisdom can be as destructive as cruelty without purpose. As the supernatural presence faded completely, Sapphira began to return to her original form. The silver sheen faded from her coat, her size decreased to normal proportions, and the glow left her eyes. Soon, she was just an ordinary camel again, the one whose eyes still held hints of the wisdom that had spoken through her. Amira ran to her transformed companion and threw her arms around the camel's neck. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." The reunion with her family was emotional beyond words. Her parents held her as if they would never let her go again, and her siblings crowded around to hear the story of her incredible journey. But even as they celebrated her safe return, Amira knew that everything had changed. The desert was still harsh, still demanding, still a place where the unwary could die quickly and horribly. But it was no longer a realm where compassion was punished as weakness or where mercy was seen as a luxury that none could afford. The ancient balance had been adjusted to make room for kindness, and while the full implications of that change would take generations to understand, Amira had played a part in making her world a gentler place. As they prepared to rejoin the caravan routes that would take them to their winter grazing grounds, Khalil approached his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern in his weathered features. "You have changed things that were older than our people," he said quietly. "The consequences will ripple through time in ways we cannot foresee. I hope you understand the weight of what you have done." Amira looked at Sapphira, who was peacefully chewing on some desert grass as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "I understand that when I had to choose between following rules and saving a life, I chose correctly," she replied. "Whatever consequences come from that choice, I'll face them without regret." Her father nodded slowly, then placed his hand on her shoulder. "Then you have learned the most important lesson the desert can teach. True wisdom lies not in following the old ways blindly, but in having the courage to forge new ones when the old ways fail to serve the cause of life." As the tribe resumed their journey under the vast canopy of desert stars, Amira walked beside Sapphira and marveled at the strange turn her life had taken. She had set out to save one dying camel and ended up helping to reshape the fundamental character of the world around her. The desert was still dangerous, still unforgiving to those who underestimated its power. But now was also a place where mercy had a voice, where compassion was recognized as a form of strength, and where the ancient balance included room for the radical notion that all life had value, regardless of its utility to the strong. The wind that night carried sounds of change across the endless expanse of sand and stone. And somewhere in that wind, those who listened carefully could hear the whisper of a new age beginning, one that would be kinder than what had come before, though no less challenging for those brave enough to embrace its possibilities.